Take it away, Prince. Really looking forward to what you have to share with us today.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone, as introduced by Professor Kilgore. I am Prince, a Government Affairs Policy Counsel at Public Knowledge. I got to do the plug. Public Knowledge, or PK, is a consumer advocacy organization that promotes freedom of expression, an open internet, and access to affordable communications tools and creative works. We work to shape public policy in the tech and telecom sectors on behalf of the public interest, so that's consumers. And at PK, I work on competition, tech competition issues, platform accountability, content moderation, copyright reform, and other issues in this space as they kind of bubble up, including Ukraine. And so I really, again, thank you for bringing me to this class, and I'm looking forward to talking about regulating internet platforms. In particular, Professor Kilgore wanted me to focus my comments on this central question. How is regulating internet platforms different from regulating past technologies? And this is an interesting question for 3 reasons. I'm a lawyer, so I'm always asking questions about words. So it's these 3 words that really captivated my attention and analysis today. And I'm asking questions about why these words, why in this order, what do they mean independently, what might they mean together? And so let's explore what these terms mean in our discussion today. So I want to define internet platforms first, and then talk about how they are different before we define regulation. Okay, so I'm gonna take those terms out of order. Then I want to explore the aims of regulation, sources of regulatory interest and power, regulatory bodies, modes, means, and then we'll talk about, towards the end, the future of tech platform regulation. Okay, so I use the terms internet platform and digital platform interchangeably, okay? And we see digital platforms that act as data aggregators and data analyzers, like Google, right, sifting through search results. We see ones that facilitate transactions, Amazon, Facebook Marketplace, IG Shops, right, Instagram stores. We also see platforms that propagate user content, Facebook, YouTube in particular, I'll highlight among many others. And then you have, companies that are hardware, software, user experience companies that I would say lock users into their ecosystem of devices like Apple and Microsoft. And this could be what we call an antitrust tying goods and services together, perhaps, to force simultaneous sales and hasten market saturation. So I just want to tease that concept. When I talk about hardware, software, user experience companies in tech. And some say that platforms must be centralized, meaning they're controlled by one company. Other scholars argue that the next generation of platforms will be decentralized or not controlled by any one company or any centralized authority. And so you can think of maybe the peer-to-peer networks of old. Remember when folks were downloading songs like crazy on Napster and LimeWire? But we have a newer version today, right? Blockchain, Ethereum networks, right? That are these decentralized platforms that some scholars would argue is the next generation platform. So in particular, Georgetown law scholar, Professor Julie E. Cohen has an amazing and canonic article about how law must change for the platform economy. And Professor Cohen defines the terms network, infrastructure, and platforms in a really nuanced and functional way for regulators. She defines network as a mode of production, organization that structures the flows of transactions and interactions through hubs and nodes, right? Then she defines infrastructure as the shared resources that facilitate downstream production. the hardware and foundational software upon which we build networks. Okay, so networks live on top of infrastructure. And then third, she defines a platform as a technical protocol that houses simultaneous networked spaces like timelines, news feeds, direct messaging, closed or invisible groups, etc. Right? So those networked spaces are housed on this technical protocol for users to conduct a wide array of heterogeneous activities in a closed universe. That's what makes the platform. So emphasizing networked spaces, closed universe, heterogeneous array of activities, right? We're trying to figure out what exactly is a platform by describing it and understanding it with these terms. I think they're really helpful. Let's also lean on Professor Cohen to tell us how internet platforms might be different from past technologies. She says platforms exploit the affordances of network organization and supply infrastructures, that word again, that facilitate particular types of interactions. But they also represent strategies for bounding networks and privatizing and controlling infrastructures. They operate with the goal of making clusters of transactions and relationships stickier enough to adhere to the platform despite participants' theoretical ability to exit and look elsewhere for other intermediation options. To accomplish that goal, she says, platforms must provide services that participants view as desirable and empowering, thereby generating and enabling participants to leverage network externalities. So let's break this down. She says that platforms exploit networks and supply infrastructures, are terms platform, network, and infrastructure, okay, coming into term together. And even bounding networks, right, and privatizing and controlling infrastructure. So it goes beyond just exploiting them, but bounding them, and beyond supplying them, but privatizing and controlling them. And so platforms provide a service that we deem desirable and empowering to allure people on it, right? And that's really what describes how a platform works, right? Because Facebook, Google, all of these platforms, they do slightly different things. Amazon is not Apple, right? Apple is not Microsoft per se. They're not all very similar, but what is the defining behavioral characteristics that makes them a genre, a sector, right, of this particular nomenclature is these kinds of ways in which they network people on the platform and keep them there. So she insinuates that platforms are different from other technologies because of their massive efficiency at structuring information and relationships, and the cultural allure, right, of housing our societal conversations. And then we become dependent on them. And she's right. Internet platforms are different from other tech companies when we think about it. They just feel different. So when we think of traditional tech companies, for over 30 years, that meant a hodgepodge of hardware companies, software companies, marketplaces, and social media websites. But look at how many times Apple, Microsoft, Google, Meta appear on this list, right? And Amazon only appears once, but it is the largest company on the list with a $2.7 billion market capitalization. And don't let this fool you. They have an elaborate sprawl of vertically integrated companies and subsidiaries that dwarf almost every other marketplace and market actor on this list, okay? So you really do see this kind of urban sprawl of ownership and integration. So Julie Cohen is describing how these companies render us individually independent, societally dependent, and internationally dependent on their provision of goods and services without regulation, right? So some believe that their function and behavior may need to be regulated to re-optimize the benefit cost analysis. So what is regulation, right? When we say to regulate, because use those terms in kind of some colored ways. So regulation often refers to government intervention in a private domain or the creation and implementation of legally binding norms to shape the conduct of market actors. So the quote on the right is from Arizona College of Law professor Barack Orbach. And he says, in other words, hey, self-interest in a capitalist system doesn't always get us the best results. Unbridled self-interest harms individuals and harms society. So to overcome these imperfections and limitations, as he calls them, we need regulation. And a goal of regulation or goals of regulations are to balance economic efficiency, environmental, or what I like to call resource sustainability, morality, and public well-being. And I'm intentionally not using the word welfare here, even though I highlighted it. I want to say well-being. And the shorthand of this is essentially maximizing benefits and minimizing costs, right? Well, I'd like to ask, why does the government care so much about regulating technology? You know, I mean, it's a very foundational question, but like, okay, this stuff is happening. I know it's in all of our lives, but why does the government care? In particular, what powers, right, might empower the government to care about regulating technology? And I think there's a simple answer to this, right? Technology's purpose is to make our lives easier, more convenient, and more fun, right? So in our capitalist economy, there's a market for tools that make life easier, more convenient, and more fun. So their ubiquity in individual and collective public and private spheres of government influence, as well as their use by governments themselves, weigh in favor of government oversight, right? Looking but not touching, I'll call oversight, and government intervention, permission or prohibition as necessary. And I want to say that term necessary as a wink and nod to the necessary and proper clause that operationalizes Congress to do whatever it needs to do to accomplish its governance mandates for the people of the United States. So the Constitution also explicitly contemplated economics, right? And in particular, incentivizing artists to make moving art, scientists to create discoveries that make our lives better so that we can understand our world, and exclusive rights for trademarks and advertisements so that people can purchase the best quality goods and services and not knockoffs with similar misleading names, right? So many read this provision into a consumer, I'll call well-being standard, and I'm intentionally staying away from welfare, okay, again. And so technology, hardware, software, and platforms, yeah, they are patentable. They are, in some sense, copyrightable. We can talk about that later in the discussion section. They are trademarked and advertised. And so they fall squarely in the intellectual property regime that the Constitution meant to grant Congress the ability to regulate and incentivize people to create inventions that make our lives better, right? That's my first response. But also because of the Commerce Clause. So in Article 1, Section 8 of the US Constitution, Congress is empowered with the authority to regulate commerce. Now, what is commerce? Commerce is almost every provision of a good or service in the stream of commerce, and Congress can regulate it. So in a 2012 case, the US Supreme Court clarified what Congress can regulate with this broad, Commerce Clause reading. And they say that channels, instrumentalities, and activities that substantially affect interstate commerce are fair game, right? What are channels of interstate commerce? They are physical conduits like highways, waterways, railroads, airspace, and telecommunications network. Think internet hardware, what connects our computers together, okay? Then what are instrumentalities? They are the things that are traveling on the channels, right? Airplanes, trains, automobiles, and the persons or things traveling in them. Think websites and web traffic, right? So this really, so we see that acts of Congress are the most constitutionally faithful ways that the government can regulate technologies, right? So the Congress is acting in its strongest when it passes a law, right, under this rationale of economic incentivization with the IP law, or with, hey, we've got control over commerce stuff and everything in it, right? So there's this, general concept that Congress is acting in its strongest when it passes an act of Congress, right? And Congress has extremely broad powers to regulate in that space, as we know. And Congress first started using this broad authority in the Interstate Commerce Act, which created the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887 to manage railroad rates and abuses that disrupted nationwide commercial activity. Okay, so in the decades to come, Congress passed legislation that regulated interstate trade, okay, which we call the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914. And communications networks, right? So you have the Federal Communications Act of 1934, and then the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which revised it, as well as, water and power, commodity exchanges, and other areas of economic activity and of national importance. Congress has passed laws and created agencies, right, that kind of oversee and do some of the day-to-day policing of these activities for it, because these activities are the economic and social lifeblood of the country. So the Federal Trade Commission is what I call a commission of general jurisdiction. So it takes rules and even decides cases about business practices in interstate trade. So platforms mostly fall under FTC jurisdiction, or what I call FTC authority. And the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC, is a sector-specific regulator overseeing business practices and protecting consumers in radio and television, cable to a lesser extent, newspapers kind of, and oversees internet infrastructure practices as well. Kind of. Okay, this is really muddy, but I want you guys to see kind of how the FTC and the FCC have this kind of joint control over internet stuff. So there is a kind of marginal content nexus here where platforms have gotten into the news business, for example, in a big way these days. Like, think of Google News, Facebook News Feed, Amazon CEO owning the Washington Post. That's not directly tied, but I think it shows you this movement that big tech sees in news, right? As well as Microsoft Start, which is their new news platform, Apple News, and Google and Apple app stores that have news applications, among others. Okay, so app stores are something that we can talk about later in this platform discussion. And sometimes the FTC and the FCC might both adjudicate the same bad practices, what we call concurrent or overlapping jurisdiction or authority over a market actor. In particular, think of cable mergers or robocalls, right? Robocalls are something that, it falls in both the FTC and the FCC, right, jurisdiction. So they might rule on something or regulate that space or those actors together. Or agencies might have what they call complementary jurisdiction, where one agency will adjudicate either one piece of business misconduct while the other agency adjudicates a separate issue in the misconduct. For example, broadband and internet mergers. Mergers tend to be something that the FTC is really charged with seeing or caring about, studying how mergers might change the market, right? If a market goes from 5 actors to 4 actors, 4 actors to 3 main actors, right? Those all have implications in how the market can function and what that means for consumers and the public. So that's an area where agencies might share complementary jurisdiction. But other times, the FTC or the FCC will team up with the Department of Justice to do
Now I can hear 'em.
enforcement. Enforcing antitrust cases or corporate criminal prosecutions. And I'm aware that you guys have read into the FTC Facebook case. Is that right? Just give me a thumbs up if you've gotten that far yet. Okay. And that's an example of joint FTC and DOJ action. Okay. But beyond commissions, okay, Congress can use what I call its soft power to haul companies into Congress and explain why their goods and services are wreaking havoc all over society. I mean, vividly, I think about the almost 8.5-hour hearing on October 23rd, 2019, which I was front row at, where the House Financial Services Committee invited Mark Zuckerberg as their only witness to talk about his cryptocurrency aspirations. But instead, they peppered him with questions about corporate governance, civil rights abuses, lack of social considerations for the unbanked and underbanked populations that he thought he was including and serving. And during the hearing, the stock price was plummeting by the hour. It was a great example of Congress's power of inquiry, an unofficial regulatory power, right? Among, I think, a few others, but I'll leave them there for now. So legal scholars, Gary Marchant and Yvonne Simmons, wrote a law review article about resilience. It's called Resilience, a New Tool in the Risk Governance Toolbox for Emerging Technologies. And in this article, they systematize how the government regulates technologies into this cool little chart, okay? So rows 2 and 3 show ex-ante approaches to regulation, right? Approaches before they enter the stream of commerce, or ex-post regulating technologies after they hit market, okay? And columns 2 and 3 chart two prominent variances in the substance of regulation. Regulation that explicitly permits technology in society or prohibits its use in society. And typically, regulators tend to permit technology whose benefits outweigh its costs, or prohibit technologies or certain uses of them when those risks outweigh the benefits. Okay, so your cost benefit analysis or risk benefit analysis here. The window chart rather shows risk analysis as a permissive ex-ante regulatory strategy, right? Because a governmental agency can permit commercial use of a technology whose benefits outweigh its risks or costs or harms. However, genetic modification of flu viruses, for example, is generally prohibited by the FDA until a particular modification, in light of a new variant, has been exhaustively tested, right? So the new mod must have overwhelming benefits that overcome the prohibition to stave off the risks. Okay, so it's constantly doing this game of, do we focus on risks and allow things out there, or do we prohibit them from going out there, right, first? But you look at that lower row, right, permissive ex post strategy of resilience is a governmental regulatory strategy of allowing technologies into market. That way, tech gets to function in real world scenarios, and the government opens up a feedback loop of constant reiteration. The government is essentially, right, recruited to improve products and with oversight instead of killing them, okay? Now leave that there, and then you have on that bottom row, prohibitive ex post regulation, which is on that bottom right, where government reacts to an accident or a scandal after commercial release of a technology by prohibiting it because of the liability it will cost. And the government discourages the proliferation of that technology by levying high liability costs or permitting private parties to exact liability, what we call private rights of action. So that means the government can open season and allow people to sue companies directly when accidents happen, as a means of discouraging them from operating in certain spaces or deploying certain technologies. Okay. But we really want to focus on the permissive ex post, right, regulation mode of resilience. And these are a list of procedural resilience strategies that have previously worked in the regulation of commercial science and technology activities. So Marchand and Stevens posit that these measures put in a process for early detection and amelioration of problems or harm. They recommend mandatory periodic review of requirements, auto sunset provisions, post-market monitoring, and emergency authority, for example, and these measures would drastically improve a regulator's responsiveness. Currently, in some sectors, regulation can take days in financial regulation, but in most cases, regulation takes years or decades. Think about computer-based technologies and how far between 1934 with the Communications Act, right? And then 1996, almost a century later, right, with the Telecoms Act, ushering in the internet. So we know that technology functions more rapidly. And we think that perhaps resilience tools, both procedurally and particularly in this instance, might hasten that process and create a quicker feedback loop. Okay. But in subsection B on the slide, you'll see substantive resilience tools, which the team say are put in place to anticipate harm reduction and adaptation. So there are measures to be better prepared to deal with harm if and when it occurs. They include auto actions like kill switches, insurance mandates, right? Knowing that a technology might cost people some marginal, right, cost, and so they might say, hey, as you develop this, you've got to have so much money in insurance to pay out claims quickly and efficiently for the harm that you'll do, but use that as a chance to practice in the real world and get better, right? There are some technologies where that's relatively harmless, where the costs are relatively low enough that people can bear it. And so just having insurance stockpiled away and paying people out for claims later might be just a way to get it out to market so people can glean the benefits and adjudicate problems as they need to. But you also have post-approval recall, right, and redundant systems instead of failure. And so that's these are some of the tools that the pair, recommend using, and not just independently, but perhaps together, right? So both procedural and substantive resilience approaches maybe can work to bring about a flexible regulatory system for emerging technologies and disruptive technologies. Okay, so public knowledge believes in a sector-specific regulator, and I'm not just plugging this because I've worked there, but this really is, right, an innovative idea that's really gaining ground that didn't just only start with us, but we were certainly one of the leaders positing in the Beltway. And we believe that a sector-specific regulator with a public interest mandate, like the FCC's mandate to serve the public interest, convenience, and necessity as duty requires, that's language directly from Communications Act, Section 301 and 303R, is really, one of the better workings or a starting place of where a digital regulator might be useful here. And we think that the agency should promote access to digital platforms among consumers so that they can, civically engage, express themselves freely online, utilize economic and educational opportunities available online in a way that's fair. And the agency should work to maintain that consumers have access to government services and public safety, because the government is also depending on these platforms to communicate with the public or to raise awareness about its actions and its accountability. Next, we think a digital regulator should protect consumers, right, from unfair, deceptive, unjust, and unreasonable business practices. by the platforms themselves or business users on the platforms. And lastly, we think that, the other side of the coin is that a digital regulator should be, required to not just promote competition, but also reduce obstacles to competition. Okay, so that's slightly different, but the same side of the coin. And the digital regulator should be required to reduce unhealthy levels of concentration, prevent further and permanent private market power of over critical digital infrastructure. So what we're seeing now, right, is that these really important means of people communicating with each other and the government communicating with its citizens are owned by private companies that can technically do what they want with it, right? Shut off government leaders, shut off certain users, really without right now procedural recourse. And so the agency, we think, should really interrogate this private control over a critical digital infrastructure as kind of one of the tenets of understanding how this market works, but also incorporating some of the resilience tools, right, in the ways that it regulates in the space, issue by issue. So finally, and I'll end here for discussion, but I have some recommended reading for the class, so I'll get this out to you all. And it's, really about all of the things that I discussed, some of the constitutional basis for regulation and other people that think what I think about like the Constitution is really priming, technology regulation, but also some more nuanced ways of how tech regulation has happened or hasn't happened or has happened by absence. And there's some really cool articles in here that nuance them, as well as some video lectures of some of the articles or authors of those articles that I think really clarify and elucidate some of these regulation entanglements really fluidly. So with that, I will end the presentation and kind of open it up for a discussion.